The bustling city streets were alive with the usual cacophony of honking cars and chattering pedestrians. But amidst the urban symphony, a different sound caught Mabel Johnson's attention: the rapid patter of small feet and panicked breathing. The 78-year-old grandmother turned just in time to see a blur of pink crash into her legs, nearly knocking her off balance. "Whoa there, little one," Mabel said softly, steadying herself with her cane. She looked down to find a trembling girl, no more than 6 or 7, clinging to her flowered skirt. The child's golden pigtails were askew, and her wide blue eyes brimmed with tears as she gazed up at Mabel. "Please," the girl whimpered, her voice barely audible above the city noise. "Please help me." Mabel's heart clenched. In her 40 years as a social worker, she'd seen that look of terror on far too many young faces. Gently, she placed a wrinkled hand on the girl's shoulder. "It's all right, sweetie. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The girl shook her head frantically, throwing fearful glances over her shoulder. I can't. They'll find me." A chill ran down Mabel's spine. Who was this child running from? And why? She scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of pursuit, but saw only the usual mix of harried commuters and tourists. "Okay, honey," Mabel said, keeping her voice calm despite her growing unease. "You don't have to tell me your name, but can you tell me what's wrong? Who are you afraid of?" The girl's lower lip quivered as she leaned in close. Mabel had to strain to hear the whispered words. "The bad people. They took me from Mommy. They said if I told anyone, they'd hurt her." Mabel's blood ran cold. Child abduction. It was every parent's worst nightmare, and a crime she'd confronted far too often in her career. She knew she had to act fast, but also carefully. One wrong move could put this little girl, and her mother, in even greater danger. "You're very brave for asking for help," Mabel said, squeezing the girl's shoulder reassuringly. "I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you and your mommy safe. But I need to call some people who can help us, okay?" The child nodded, her grip on Mabel's skirt tightening. With shaking fingers, Mabel pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. As she waited for the call to connect, she scanned the street again. This time, she noticed 2 men in dark jackets standing near a parked van, their eyes fixed intently on her and the girl. Mabel's heart raced. Were these the bad people the child had mentioned? She turned slightly, using her body to shield the girl from view as a dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone. 911, what's your emergency?" Mabel spoke quietly but urgently. "This is Mabel Johnson. I'm at the corner of 5th and Main with a young girl who says she's been kidnapped. I think the abductors might be nearby. We need help immediately." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Stay where you are, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Can you describe the girl and any potential suspects?" As Mabel relayed the information, she felt a tug on her sleeve. The little girl was pointing across the street, her eyes wide with terror. Mabel followed her gaze to see a black SUV pulling up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a hard-faced woman who locked eyes with the child. "They're here," the girl whimpered, trying to burrow further into Mabel's side. Mabel's mind raced. They couldn't run. Her arthritic knees and the child's short legs wouldn't get them far. But they couldn't stay put either, not with danger closing in from both sides. She needed a plan, and fast. Just then, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd: Tom, the owner of the corner bodega where she bought her morning coffee. He was unlocking the shop's front door, oblivious to the drama unfolding mere feet away. "Come on, sweetheart," Mabel said, guiding the girl towards the store. "We're going to visit a friend of mine." They had only taken a few steps when a rough voice called out behind them. "Hey, old lady, hand over the kid and walk away. This doesn't concern you." Mabel's spine stiffened, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she quickened her pace as much as her creaky joints would allow. "Tom," she called out, relief flooding her as the shopkeeper looked up. "Tom, we need help." The urgency in her voice must have registered because Tom's eyes widened. He quickly ushered them inside, locking the door behind them just as the men from the van reached the storefront. They pounded on the glass, shouting demands and threats. "What's going on, Mabel?" Tom asked, his voice shaking as he reached for the phone behind the counter. "Call the police," Mabel instructed, leading the trembling girl towards the back of the store. "Tell them there's an attempted kidnapping in progress." As Tom made the call, Mabel knelt down in front of the child, her old knees protesting the movement. "You're doing great, sweetie. Help is on the way. Can you tell me anything else about the people who took you? Anything that might help the police find your mom?" The girl's lip quivered, but determination shone in her eyes. They have a star on their hands. A blue star. I saw it when they grabbed me." Mabel's breath caught. A blue star tattoo. It was a detail that could prove crucial for the investigation. She was about to ask for more information when the sound of shattering glass filled the air. The men had broken through the store's front window. Tom rushed to join them in the back, his face pale with fear. "The cops are coming, but those guys are inside now. What do we do?" Mabel's mind raced. They needed to buy more time. Her eyes fell on the stockroom door. "In there," she whispered, quick and quiet. They slipped into the dimly lit room just as heavy footsteps approached. Mabel held her breath, one arm wrapped protectively around the little girl. She could hear the men ransacking the store, calling out threats and promises in equal measure. Come out, wherever you are," a gruff voice sing-songed. "You're only making this worse for yourselves." The girl whimpered softly, and Mabel gently covered her mouth with a weathered hand. Every second felt like an eternity as they huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds of destruction beyond the thin wooden door. Just when Mabel thought her nerves couldn't take any more, a new sound cut through the chaos. Police sirens, growing louder by the second. She sagged with relief as shouts of "NOEPD, hands where we can see them," echoed through the store. What followed was a blur of activity. The door flew open, and Mabel found herself face to face with a young officer, his gun drawn. Upon seeing them, his expression softened from alertness to concern. "It's okay," he said gently, holstering his weapon. "You're safe now. We got the suspects in custody." As they emerged from their hiding place, Mabel saw the men who had terrorized them being led away in handcuffs. The hard-faced woman from the SUV was there too, her cold facade crumbling as an officer read her rights. While paramedics checked them over for injuries, Mabel kept a close eye on the little girl. The child seemed to be in shock, her small body still trembling. But there was also a spark of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A female detective approached, kneeling down to the girl's eye level. "Hey there, brave girl," she said warmly. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, okay? And we're already working on finding your mom." As the girl was led away, she turned back to Mabel, a tiny smile breaking through her fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Mabel felt tears prick her eyes. In all her years of social work, she'd seen so many children failed by the system, by the adults who were supposed to protect them. But today, against all odds, they'd managed to save one. It wasn't the end of the story. There would be questions to answer, traumas to heal, a family to reunite. But it was a start, a chance at a happy ending. As the adrenaline began to fade, leaving her feeling every one of her 78 years, Mabel sank onto a nearby bench. She watched the flashing lights of the police cars, the curious onlookers gathering behind the yellow tape, the news vans already pulling up to the curb. And she wondered, what would happen next? Would they find the girl's mother in time? And how many other children were out there right now, silently crying out for help? The story was far from over. But for now, in this moment, one small voice had been heard. One child had been saved, and for Mabel Johnson, retired social worker turned unexpected hero, that was enough to keep hope alive. As the chaos of the rescue scene gradually settled, Mabel found herself in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. The adrenaline that had fueled her during the confrontation was fading, leaving her feeling every ache in her aging bones. But her mind remained sharp, focused on the little girl who had trusted her with her life. Detective Sarah Martinez slid into the ambulance beside Mabel, her dark eyes filled with a mix of admiration and concern. "Mrs. Johnson, I can't thank you enough for what you did today. You very likely saved that child's life." Mabel waved off the praise. "Anyone would have done the same. What matters now is finding her mother and making sure she's safe. Have you learned anything more?" The detective's expression tightened. "We're working on it. The girl's name is Emily Rossi. She's 7 years old and was reported missing 3 days ago by her father, Michael Rossi. He said Emily and her mother, Angela, never returned from a trip to the park." 3 days, Mabel murmured, her heart aching for the fear and confusion Emily must have endured. But why take both of them? And where is Angela now? Detective Martinez shook her head. That's what we're trying to figure out. The kidnappers aren't talking, but the blue star tattoo Emily mentioned, that's a known symbol of the Cerulean Syndicate. Mabel's breath caught. Even she, removed from her social work days, had heard whispers of the Cerulean Syndicate. They were a shadowy organization with tentacles in everything from drug trafficking to white-collar crime. But child abduction, that was a new and terrifying development. We think Angela may have witnessed something she shouldn't have, the detective continued, her voice low. Taking her and Emily could have been a way to ensure her silence. But until we find her, the unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Every passing hour decreased the chances of finding Angela alive. As if sensing the dark turn of Mabel's thoughts, Detective Martinez placed a reassuring hand on her arm. We're doing everything we can, and thanks to you and Emily, we dealt a significant blow to the syndicate's operations. The people we arrested today, they're big players. With any luck, one of them will crack and give us the information we need. Mabel nodded, trying to hold on to hope. She thought of Emily, probably scared and confused in a strange place, surrounded by well-meaning strangers. What will happen to her now? She's been taken to a safe house with round-the-clock protection, the detective explained. We can't risk the syndicate making another attempt to grab her. Her father is on his way there now. A flicker of unease passed through Mabel. Something about the situation nagged at her, a feeling honed by decades of working with families in crisis. Detective, may I make a suggestion? Martinez leaned in, curious. Of course. I know protocol probably says otherwise, but I'd like to stay with Emily, at least until her father arrives. She's been through so much trauma, a familiar face might help. The detective hesitated, weighing procedure against compassion. Finally, she nodded. I'll have to clear it with my superiors, but I think we can make that happen. Your insight could be valuable, especially if Emily remembers any other details that could help us find her mother. As they made their way to the safe house, Mabel's mind whirled with questions. Why had Angela and Emily been at that park 3 days ago? Had Angela stumbled upon some syndicate operation by accident, or was there more to the story? And where was she now? The safe house turned out to be a modest apartment in a nondescript building, its windows reinforced and security cameras discreetly placed at every entrance. Inside, Mabel found Emily curled up on a worn sofa, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days. The girl's face lit up when she saw Mabel. You came, she exclaimed, some of the fear leaving her eyes. Mabel settled beside her, her old joints protesting the movement. Of course I did, sweetheart. I promised I'd help keep you safe, didn't I? As they waited for Emily's father to arrive, Mabel gently coaxed more of the story from the girl. Emily spoke of a day at the park that had started normally enough. Ice cream, a trip down the big slide, her mother laughing as she pushed her on the swings. But then Angela had gone very still, her eyes fixed on something across the street. Mommy got really scared, Emily whispered. She grabbed my hand and said we had to leave right away. The bad people were already there. Mabel's heart ached as Emily described being bundled into a van, her mother's desperate struggles, the long drive to a place with no windows. They had been separated almost immediately, with Emily kept in a small room and visited only by the woman with the hard face, the same woman Mabel had seen in the SUV. She kept asking me questions about Daddy, Emily said, her small brow furrowed in confusion. If he ever had special visitors, or if he went away on trips a lot. But I didn't know what she meant. Mabel exchanged a loaded glance with Detective Martinez, who had been quietly taking notes nearby. There was clearly more to this kidnapping than a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what connection could Michael Rossi have to the Cerulean Syndicate? Before they could probe further, there was a commotion at the door. A man burst in, his clothes rumpled and his eyes wild with a mix of fear and hope. Emily, he cried. Daddy. Emily leaped from the sofa and into her father's arms. Mabel watched the reunion with a mix of joy and unease. There was something off about Michael Rossi's behavior, a tension in his shoulders, a flicker in his eyes as he glanced around the room. It could easily be attributed to the stress of the past few days, but Mabel's instincts, honed by years of working with troubled families, told her there was more to the story. As Michael peppered Emily with questions and reassurances, Detective Martinez pulled Mabel aside. What do you think? She asked in a low voice. Mabel chose her words carefully. It's clear he loves his daughter. But there's something he's not telling us. The way the kidnappers were asking Emily about him, I don't think this was random. The detective nodded, her expression grim. I agree. We'll need to dig deeper into Michael Rossi's background, see if there are any connections to the syndicate we missed. But our priority has to be finding Angela. Just then, Michael approached them, Emily clinging to his leg. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for saving my little girl. Please, tell me you're close to finding Angela. Detective Martinez assured him they were pursuing every lead, but Mabel found herself studying his face. There was genuine worry there, yes, but also guilt. Fear that went beyond concern for his missing wife. As the detective continued to brief Michael on the situation, Mabel felt a tug on her sleeve. She looked down to find Emily gazing up at her with wide, serious eyes. Miss Mabel, the girl whispered, I remembered something else, something important. But I'm scared to say it. Mabel's heart raced. What had this child seen or heard that frightened her so much? And how would it change the course of this increasingly complex investigation? As she knelt down to Emily's level, prepared to hear whatever secret the girl held, Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something far bigger and more dangerous than anyone had initially suspected. The mystery of Angela's disappearance, the Cerulean Syndicate's involvement, Michael Rossi's hidden secrets. All the pieces were there, waiting to fall into place. But would they solve the puzzle in time to save Angela, or were they already too late? Mabel leaned in close, her weathered face a mask of calm despite the storm of worry brewing inside her. It's okay, Emily, she whispered, acutely aware of Michael Rossi's curious gaze on them. You can tell me anything. I promise I'll do my best to keep you safe. Emily's eyes darted nervously to her father before she spoke, her voice barely audible. I saw Daddy's special friend at the park that day, the one who comes to our house late at night sometimes. He was talking to the bad people before they took us. The revelation hit Mabel like a physical blow. She struggled to keep her expression neutral as she gently squeezed Emily's hand. Thank you for being so brave, sweetheart. You've done nothing wrong. Why don't you go sit with your dad while I talk to Detective Martinez for a minute? As Emily scampered back to Michael, Mabel pulled the detective aside, her mind racing. We need to talk, she murmured, but not here. Martinez seemed to catch on immediately, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Michael Rossi. Mr. Rossi, she called out, I need to step out for a moment to update my team. An officer will be right outside if you need anything. Once they were in the hallway, Mabel quickly relayed Emily's whispered confession. The detective's face darkened with each word. This complicates things, she said, running a hand through her hair. If Michael Rossi is involved with the syndicate, we can't leave Emily in his custody. But we can't tip our hand either, not until we know more about Angela's whereabouts. What's our next move? Mabel asked, feeling every bit of her 78 years but determined to see this through. Martinez's jaw set in determination. We need to dig deeper into Rossi's background, and fast. I'll have my team pull his financials, phone records, everything. In the meantime, I want you to stay close to Emily. She trusts you. If there's anything else she remembers, anything at all, we need to know. As they re-entered the safe house, Mabel couldn't help but see Michael Rossi in a new light. The worried father act suddenly seemed just that, an act. She watched as he fussed over Emily, his movements a touch too exaggerated, his eyes constantly darting to the door. Hours crawled by, tension thick in the air. Mabel did her best to keep Emily distracted with quiet games and stories, all the while hyper-aware of Michael's every move. As night fell, Martinez returned, her face grim. Mr. Rossi, she said, her voice carefully neutral, I need to ask you a few more questions about the days leading up to your wife and daughter's disappearance. Would you mind stepping outside with me? Michael's face paled slightly, but he nodded. Of course. Emily, honey, stay here with Miss Mabel, okay? Daddy will be right back. As soon as the door closed behind them, Emily turned to Mabel, her eyes wide with fear. Is Daddy in trouble? She whispered. Mabel's heart ached. How could she explain the complexities of the situation to a child? I'm not sure, sweetie, she said gently, but I promise you, the police are doing everything they can to find your mom and make sure you're safe. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Detective Martinez was facing off against an increasingly agitated Michael Rossi. "I've already told you everything I know," he insisted, sweat beading on his forehead. "I don't understand why you're wasting time questioning me when you should be out there looking for Angela." Martinez's voice was steel. "Mr. Rossi, we have reason to believe you haven't been entirely truthful with us. Financial records show large sums of money moving through accounts in your name, amounts that don't match up with your reported income. Care to explain?" Michael's facade cracked. "You don't understand," he hissed, glancing nervously at the closed door. "They'll kill her if I talk. They'll kill all of us." Before Martinez could press further, her phone buzzed. Her eyes widened as she read the message. "We got a location on Angela Rossi," she said sharply. "Mr. Rossi, you're coming with us. Now." Inside the safe house, Mabel felt the shift in energy even before the door burst open. Martinez strode in, her face a mask of determined focus. "Mrs. Johnson, I need you to stay here with Emily. We may have a lead on her mother, but I can't say more right now. Whatever happens, do not open this door for anyone but me. Understood?" Mabel nodded, pulling Emily close as the girl whimpered in confusion. "Daddy," she called out, but Michael was already being led away, his face a mix of fear and resignation. As the sound of hurried footsteps faded, Mabel found herself alone with a terrified child and a mountain of questions. What had Michael Rossi gotten his family into? Was Angela still alive? And most pressingly, were they truly safe in this so-called safe house? Hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Mabel did her best to comfort Emily, but her own nerves were frayed. Every creak of the building, every distant siren set her on edge. She found herself wishing for her old social worker days when she at least had a playbook to follow in crisis situations. Just past midnight, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Detective Martinez. We're coming in." The door opened to reveal the detective, looking exhausted but grimly triumphant, and behind her, pale and shaken but blessedly alive, was Angela Rossi. "Mommy!" Emily's cry of joy pierced the air as she launched herself into her mother's arms. As the reunited pair clung to each other, Mabel turned to Martinez, her voice low. "What happened? Where's Michael?" The detective's expression was hard to read. "It's complicated. Michael Rossi was indeed involved with the Cerulean Syndicate, but not willingly. He was being blackmailed. They threatened his family if he didn't launder money for them. When Angela accidentally witnessed a transaction, they panicked and grabbed them both." Mabel's mind reeled. But why separate them? Why keep Emily? "Insurance," Martinez said grimly. They knew Michael would do anything to keep his daughter safe. What they didn't count on was Angela's resilience or your intervention. As the adrenaline of the past few days began to ebb, Mabel sank into a nearby chair, suddenly feeling every one of her years. She watched as Emily chattered excitedly to her mother, the trauma of recent events momentarily forgotten in the joy of reunion. But Mabel knew the story was far from over. Michael Rossi was in custody, his fate uncertain. The Cerulean Syndicate, while dealt a blow, was still out there. And this little family would have a long road ahead as they grappled with the aftermath of their ordeal. As if reading her thoughts, Detective Martinez placed a hand on Mabel's shoulder. "We couldn't have done this without you, Mrs. Johnson. Your instincts, your compassion, they made all the difference." Mabel smiled wearily. "I'm just glad I could help, but what happens now?" Martinez's gaze turned determined. Now we make sure the syndicate can never do this to another family. This is just the beginning." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Mabel Johnson realized that her unexpected adventure was far from over. There were still questions to be answered, justice to be served, and a little girl who would need all the support she could get in the days to come. The elderly woman who had thought her days of making a difference were long behind her squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, as long as there were children in need, Mabel would always answer the call. The days following Angela's rescue were a whirlwind of activity. Mabel found herself swept up in the ongoing investigation, her unexpected role as Emily's protector evolving into that of a key witness. The safe house became a hub of constant comings and goings, detectives, social workers, and a parade of stern-faced individuals Mabel could only assume were from agencies whose names were never meant to be spoken aloud. Through it all, Emily clung to her mother like a lifeline, her earlier resilience giving way to a fragile vulnerability that broke Mabel's heart. Angela, for her part, seemed to be walking a tightrope between relief at their reunion and a gnawing fear of what was yet to come. "They're still out there," Angela confided to Mabel one evening, her voice barely above a whisper as Emily slept nearby. "The people Michael was involved with, they have connections everywhere. How can we ever truly be safe?" Mabel wished she had a reassuring answer, but the truth was, she shared Angela's concerns. The Cerulean Syndicate's reach seemed to extend far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Each new piece of information uncovered only revealed how deep the rabbit hole went. Detective Martinez became a constant presence, her determination to bring down the syndicate burning with an intensity that both reassured and unsettled Mabel. "We're close to something big," she would say, poring over files late into the night. "Michael's testimony is the key. If we can get him to give us names, locations, we could potentially dismantle their entire operation." But Michael Rossi, it seemed, was proving to be a tough nut to crack. Held in protective custody at an undisclosed location, he vacillated between moments of cooperation and long stretches of terrified silence. "He's scared," Angela explained, her eyes haunted. "You don't understand what these people are capable of. The things Michael told me when we were separated. It's not just about us anymore. There are other families, other children. If he talks." The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. The stakes were higher than any of them had imagined. As days stretched into weeks, a tense routine settled over the safe house. Mabel found herself taking on the role of de facto grandmother, providing a sense of normalcy for Emily as Angela worked with the authorities to piece together the extent of the syndicate's operations. But beneath the veneer of calm, tension simmered. Strange cars lingered a bit too long on their street. Unmarked vehicles with tinted windows appeared and disappeared at odd hours, and always, the feeling of being watched. It was Emily who first noticed the man in the park across from their building. "He's been there every day this week," she said casually, peering out the window during a game of I Spy. "Always sitting on the same bench, always wearing a blue hat." Mabel's blood ran cold. She casually drew the curtains, her mind racing. Was it paranoia, or had their safe haven been compromised? That night, as Emily slept and Angela paced restlessly, Mabel pulled Detective Martinez aside. "We need to move," she said firmly. "It's not safe here anymore." Martinez's face tightened. "You're right. We've suspected for a few days now that our location might have been leaked. We didn't want to alarm you, but we've been making arrangements. Tomorrow night, we move to a new safe house. One that not even I know the location of until we're en route." Mabel nodded, relief warring with a new surge of anxiety. "What about Michael? Will he be moved too?" The detective's hesitation spoke volumes. "That's complicated. We're close to a breakthrough with him. He's agreed to give us names, but he's insisting on one condition. He wants to see Emily and Angela first." "Absolutely not," Mabel said fiercely, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "It's too dangerous. For all we know, he could be setting a trap." Martinez held up a placating hand. "I understand your concern, but this could be our one shot at bringing down the entire syndicate. We'll take every precaution. The meeting will be at a secure location, heavily guarded. And we need you there, Mrs. Johnson. Emily trusts you. If things go sideways, you might be our best chance at keeping her calm." Mabel wanted to argue further. The determined set of Martinez's jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she simply asked, "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Before the move to the new safe house. I'll brief Angela tonight, but please, don't tell Emily. The less she knows, the safer she'll be." As Martinez left to make the final arrangements, Mabel sank into a chair, her mind whirling. She thought of Emily, finally sleeping peacefully after weeks of nightmares. Of Angela, carrying the weight of her family's fate on her shoulders. Of Michael, a man caught between love for his family and fear of an unseen enemy. And somewhere out there, lurking in the shadows, the Cerulean Syndicate waited, their patience as limitless as their reach. Mabel Johnson, retired social worker turned unlikely guardian, steeled herself for what was to come. Tomorrow would bring either the breakthrough they'd all been hoping for, or the moment their fragile safety shattered completely. As the clock ticked relentlessly toward dawn, she found herself whispering a quiet prayer to whatever higher power might be listening. "Keep us safe," she murmured, "and give us the strength for whatever comes next." The night stretched on, each passing hour bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one family, but potentially the future of an entire criminal empire. As the first hints of daylight began to creep across the sky, Mabel rose, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. Little did she know, the true test of her courage, and the ultimate reckoning with the Cerulean Syndicate, was just hours away. The morning dawned gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for the tension that hung heavy in the air. Mabel helped Angela get Emily ready, her heart aching at the child's innocence as she chatted excitedly about the adventure they were going on. If only she knew the true nature of their journey. As they piled into an unmarked van, Mabel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She scanned the street, her eyes narrowing at a glint of blue in the distance. Was it the same man Emily had spotted in the park? Before she could voice her concerns, Detective Martinez ushered them inside, her face a mask of professional calm. The drive to the secure location was tense and silent. Emily, picking up on the adult's mood, clung tightly to her mother's hand. Mabel found herself running through worst-case scenarios in her mind, formulating plans for every possible outcome. When they finally arrived at a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city, Mabel's unease only grew. The place seemed too quiet, too empty. Martinez led them through a maze of hallways, each turn bringing them deeper into the heart of the building. "Michael's in there," Martinez said, gesturing to a door at the end of a long corridor. "Remember, we'll be monitoring everything. If anything feels off, give the signal, and we'll extract you immediately." Angela nodded, her face pale but determined. As they approached the door, Mabel felt Emily's small hand slip into hers. She gave it a reassuring squeeze, praying that her own nervousness didn't show. The room was stark and windowless, dominated by a large table, and there, looking haggard and haunted, sat Michael Rossi. His eyes lit up at the sight of his family, but Mabel didn't miss the flicker of fear that crossed his face. "Angela, Emily," he breathed, rising halfway before remembering the restraints that kept him tethered to the table. "I'm so sorry. For everything." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Angela stepped forward, arms outstretched, a deafening explosion rocked the building. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Mabel instinctively pulled Emily close, her ears ringing from the blast. "Everyone down." Martinez's voice cut through the chaos. The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere down the hall. In the dim emergency lighting, Mabel saw Michael struggling with his restraints. "It's a trap," he yelled. They knew. They'd been planning this. Before anyone could react, the door burst open. Men in tactical gear swarmed the room, their faces hidden behind masks. Mabel's heart nearly stopped as she recognized a familiar blue star patch on their sleeves. The Cerulean Syndicate had found them. "Nobody move," the lead intruder barked. "We're taking the girl and Rossi. Anyone tries to be a hero, and this place goes up in flames." Time seemed to stand still as Mabel locked eyes with Angela. In that moment, a lifetime of social work experience, of protecting the vulnerable, crystallized into a single, desperate plan. "Take me instead," Mabel said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm the one who foiled your operation. Emily's just a child. She doesn't know anything." The leader hesitated, clearly thrown by this unexpected offer. In that moment of confusion, all hell broke loose. Martinez, who had been inching closer unnoticed, suddenly sprang into action. She tackled the nearest intruder, sending his weapon skittering across the floor. "Run," she yelled, grappling with the man. Michael, somehow free of his restraints, lunged for the fallen gun. Angela scooped up Emily and made a dash for the door. Mabel moved to follow, but a rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "You're coming with us, old lady," a gruff voice snarled in her ear. As she was dragged away, Mabel caught one last glimpse of Emily's terrified face disappearing around a corner. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air as the syndicate members retreated, taking their unexpected hostage with them. Mabel's last coherent thought before a hood was roughly shoved over her head was a fervent hope that her sacrifice had bought enough time for the others to escape. As she was bundled into what felt like the back of a van, The elderly woman who had thought her adventure was over found herself at the center of a storm that was only just beginning. Miles away, in a room filled with glowing monitors, a figure watched the chaos unfold with cold calculation. Interesting, they murmured, fingers steepled beneath their chin. Very interesting indeed. It seems we've underestimated the old social worker. No matter. This game is far from over. As the van carrying Mabel sped away into the unknown, the true architect of the Cerulean Syndicate's grand plan began to move their pieces into place. The next phase was about to begin, and Mabel Johnson, unbeknownst to her, held the key to unraveling it all. The war against the Syndicate had just escalated beyond anyone's wildest imagination, with an unlikely hero at its very center. The van screeched to a halt, jolting Mabel from her disoriented state. Rough hands yanked her out, a hood still obscuring her vision. She stumbled, her arthritic knees protesting, but managed to stay upright. The hood was suddenly ripped away, and Mabel blinked in the harsh fluorescent light of what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. Well, a silky voice cut through the air. The meddling grandmother herself. I must say, you've caused us quite a bit of trouble, Mrs. Johnson. Mabel's eyes focused on a figure emerging from the shadows, a woman in an impeccable suit, her silver hair swept into a severe bun. Recognition dawned, and Mabel gasped. Senator Harrison, but you're on the anti-trafficking committee. How could you be involved with the syndicate? The senator's laugh was cold and brittle. Oh, my dear. Who better to run a criminal empire than someone above suspicion? Now tell me everything you know about our operations, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Mabel's mind raced. She thought of Emily, of Angela and Michael, of Detective Martinez. She prayed they had escaped, that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Drawing herself up to her full height, Mabel fixed the senator with a steely gaze. I may be old, but I'm not stupid. You'll get nothing from me. Harrison's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many powerful people are involved. Your little act of heroism changes nothing. Just then, a commotion erupted outside. The sound of screeching tires and shouting filled the air. Harrison's face contorted with rage. How did they find us so quickly? She snarled, reaching for a concealed weapon. But before she could act, the warehouse doors burst open. Detective Martinez led a team of heavily armed officers, their weapons trained on the syndicate members. NOIP. Everybody freeze. In the chaos that followed, Mabel found herself pulled to safety by a familiar face. Michael Rossi. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. But when they took you, I knew I had to make it right. I told them everything. Every name, every location. It's over. As the dust settled and handcuffs clicked into place, Mabel's relief was tempered by confusion. But how did you find me so quickly? Martinez approached, a tired smile on her face. That would be thanks to your young friend Emily. Turns out, in all the confusion, she managed to slip her mother's phone into your pocket. We tracked the GPS signal right to you. Mabel's eyes filled with tears. That brave, clever girl. And Emily? Angela? Are they safe? They're fine, Martinez assured her. In protective custody until we're sure we've rounded up all the major players. But thanks to Michael's testimony and the evidence we gathered here, the Cerulean Syndicate is finished. As Senator Harrison was led away in handcuffs, spitting threats and promises of revenge, Mabel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. They had won. Or so she thought. Later, as Mabel was being checked over by paramedics, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two officers. Can you believe it? The encrypted files we found on the senator's computer. It goes so much deeper than we thought. Government officials, judges, even foreign diplomats. This is going to shake the foundations of. The voices faded as they moved away, but the implications hung heavy in the air. The syndicate might be defeated, but the ripple effects of its fall were only just beginning. As dawn broke over the city, Mabel found herself sitting on the steps of the warehouse, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. Detective Martinez sat beside her, both women lost in thought. What happens now? Mabel asked softly. Martinez sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. Honestly, I'm not sure. This case, it's opened a Pandora's box. The next few months are going to be a political and legal minefield. But for you, Mrs. Johnson, I'd say you've more than earned your retirement. Mabel chuckled, wincing slightly at her aching muscles. Funny, I was just starting to think I might be cut out for this detective work after all. As if on cue, a small figure came barreling towards them. Miss Mabel, Emily cried, flinging herself into the older woman's arms. Angela followed close behind, tears of relief and gratitude shining in her eyes. Holding Emily close, Mabel looked out at the city skyline, now bathed in the soft light of a new day. The Cerulean Syndicate was finished, but she knew in her heart that this was far from the end of the story. There would be trials, testimonies, and likely more dangers to face. But as she sat there, surrounded by the unlikely family she had found in the midst of chaos, Mabel Johnson knew one thing for certain: whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The terrified little girl who had run to her on that fateful day had set in motion a chain of events that would change countless lives. And Mabel, the retired social worker who had thought her days of making a difference were long behind her, realized that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we least expect them. As Emily's small hand slipped into hers, Mabel smiled. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it head-on. After all, she mused, age is just a number. And some heroes don't wear capes, they wear sensible shoes and carry a lifetime of wisdom in their hearts. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the city, Mabel found herself in a whirlwind of activity. The warehouse had become a hub of law enforcement, with officers cataloging evidence and escorting handcuffed syndicate members to waiting vehicles. Detective Martinez was orchestrating it all, barking orders and coordinating with various agencies. Amidst the chaos, Mabel held Emily close, the little girl's presence a reminder of why they had fought so hard. Angela and Michael stood nearby, their faces a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The family's ordeal wasn't over yet. There would be statements to give, trials to attend, a life to rebuild. But they were together, and for now, that was enough. Mrs. Johnson, Martinez called, approaching with a grim expression. "We need to talk." Privately. Mabel's heart sank. She had a feeling the other shoe was about to drop. Giving Emily's hand a reassuring squeeze, she followed the detective to a quiet corner of the warehouse. "What we've uncovered here, it's bigger than we could have imagined," Martinez began, her voice low and urgent. "The syndicate's reach extends to the highest levels of government, not just here but internationally. We're talking about a network that's been operating in the shadows for decades." Mabel nodded slowly, the weight of this revelation settling on her shoulders. "And let me guess, you need my help again." Martinez's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" "Detective, I may be old, but I'm far from stupid," Mabel said with a wry smile. "You wouldn't be telling me this unless you needed something from me. So, out with it. What's the plan?" For a moment, Martinez looked like she might argue, but then she sighed, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "We need someone on the inside. Someone they won't suspect. The syndicate may be wounded, but it's not defeated. There are still key players out there, and they'll be looking to regroup." Mabel's mind raced. "And you think a retired social worker is the answer? I'm flattered. But—" "Not just any retired social worker," Martinez interrupted. "You, Mrs. Johnson, the woman who brought down Senator Harrison. Word of your involvement has spread. There are people in high places who are very interested in meeting you." As the implications sank in, Mabel felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. This wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about dismantling a system of corruption that had ruined countless lives. But the risks. She glanced over at Emily and her parents, her heart aching at the thought of leaving them. As if sensing her gaze, Emily looked up and waved, a bright smile on her face. In that moment, Mabel made her decision. "All right," she said, turning back to Martinez. "I'm in, but on one condition. Emily and her family get the best protection possible. No loose ends." Martinez nodded solemnly. "You have my word. We'll set them up with new identities, a fresh start far from here." As they rejoined the others, Mabel steeled herself for the difficult goodbye ahead. But before she could speak, a commotion near the warehouse entrance caught everyone's attention. A sleek black car had pulled up, and from it emerged a figure that made even the hardened police officers stand at attention. The president's chief of staff strode purposefully towards them, flanked by Secret Service agents. Mrs. Johnson, he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable air of authority. Your country needs you. We'd have reason to believe that the syndicate's influence extends to our closest allies. We need someone we can trust to help us navigate this political minefield. Mabel blinked, momentarily stunned. This was far beyond anything she had imagined. She looked at Martinez, who seemed equally surprised by this turn of events. Taking a deep breath, Mabel squared her shoulders. Well, she said, a hint of her old spark returning to her eyes, I suppose my retirement will have to wait a bit longer. As she prepared to leave with the chief of staff, Mabel knelt down to Emily's level. I have to go away for a while, sweetheart, she said gently. But I promise I'll come back. And when I do, we'll have that ice cream sundae you've been asking for. Emily's lower lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. You're going to help other kids like me, aren't you? Mabel's heart swelled with pride. That's right, honey. That's exactly what I'm going to do. With one last hug for Emily and heartfelt goodbyes to Angela and Michael, Mabel allowed herself to be escorted to the waiting car. As she settled into the plush leather seat, she couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns her life had taken. From a chance encounter with a terrified little girl to becoming a key player in an international operation to dismantle a global criminal network. It was almost too much to believe. Yet here she was, Mabel Johnson, retired social worker turned unlikely hero, embarking on the most important mission of her life. As the car pulled away from the warehouse, Mabel gazed out the window at the city she had called home for so long. She didn't know when she'd see these familiar streets again, or what dangers lay ahead. But she did know one thing. As long as there were children like Emily who needed protection, as long as there were injustices to be righted, she would never stop fighting. The car turned a corner, and the warehouse disappeared from view. Mabel took a deep breath, ready to face whatever challenges awaited her. After all, she mused with a small smile, age really is just a number. And sometimes, the most unlikely heroes are the ones who make the biggest difference. As the city faded into the distance, Mabel Johnson prepared herself for the next chapter of her extraordinary journey. A journey that had begun with one small act of kindness and now held the potential to change the world.